This video is brought to you by the Microsoft Virtual Academy. Welcome to the first part of a two-part series on Configuration Manager 2012 Application Management. In this session, we are going to cover an overview of software distribution in Config Manager 2012 and talk about the creation, deployment, and monitoring of applications and a new feature of 12 called Device Affinity. We'll talk about simple apps and more complex rules. We'll talk about revision management, as well as content, applications, and operating system deployment. So why would we go through the process of changing the most heavily used feature of our product that's been in market for 16 years? Well, our data has shown us that the end user is actually changing more than we are. They're using applications in new locations that are mobile, that are on new hardware or variations of hardware, as well as different connectivity scenarios. But the bottom line is our data has shown us that organizations are having to manage heavily mobile-based workforce who have an agnostic approach to a large list of devices and have different expectations for their use of technology and how their expectations are set with the IT departments. In addition, organizations are experiencing a changing world of applications. AppV, software as a service, data center hosted, for example VDI, or mobile apps are causing organizations to consider different delivery mechanisms and platforms as well as processes for managing these experiences. Well, what did we do? We rewrote our definitions of an application from package program, and don't jump off a cliff because package and programs are still there, but the concept behind this is now very simplified in the fact that we now have an application that can take on different deployment types for the way your users are using your applications in the ways they find themselves connected on different devices. So let's talk about what an application looks like. So we have some general information about the software application. Inside of this, there are administrative properties to help keep apps organized and managed. We have end user metadata, which is the friendly terminology or information end users look for. And then we have something called the deployment type. And the icons down the left, AppV, script, Windows installer, and mobile cab, are versions of a deployment type, which is the engine or the format for the application that is being delivered. And a deployment type is made up of some different criteria. Detection method, is the app installed? An install command, command line and options. Requirement rules, can the app be installed or not? Dependencies, the app that must be present or not, or other dependencies or other applications that must be there for the application to run, as well as content, the source files for the application, the actual setup exe, etc. So when we think about Config Manager 07 to 2012 and this comparison of what's called the application model, as we go down the left side of this table and talk about a feature, I'll compare it to what is now in Config Manager 2012 from 07. So beginning with the create model software, in Config Manager 07 we had the classic package and program, which was effectively just the command line that was running for the application. In Config Manager 2012 we have applications and deployment types that now replace package program. Package and program is still available, but we now have deployment types to replace most of those scenarios. The concept of deploying software in Config Manager 07 was called an advertisement. This is now called a deployment. It is state-based and via detection methods that we value against rules and criteria. A concept called targeting, a feature called targeting in 07 was called collection rules. We now have what's called requirement rules, now server or client hosted instead of the server. User targeting, we didn't really have that, or it was done by proxy through hardware in Config Manager 07, is now considered covered by what we call user device affinity. Effectively, a user's relationship to the hardware they find themselves interacting with connectivity scenarios like networks or remote scenarios on. The client user experience was, for a Config Manager 07 environment, was called the Run Advertise program, which was experienced off of the control panel and an applet inside of there. We now have something in Config Manager 2012 that is very rich in Silverlight, which is called the Software Center. Software being installed from a website was not possible in Config Manager 07 without third-party or partner support. We now have within Config Manager 2012 something called a software catalog, which is an IIS web-based service that allows users in an organization to browse, search, and look for installations of applications themselves. Content management in ConfigMgr 07 was limited. There was some capability there, but not like the level of management we have created in 12. In ConfigMgr 2012, we've introduced something called a content library that allows for a significantly improved experience of managing content around the network from things like a replication perspective. So we have something called state-based application management now being used within the application model. And this is something called detection methods, and enabling systems to determine whether or not an app is already on a system or not is incredibly important in improving user experience and ensuring that the application is considered there when in fact it really is there. Well, there's many ways that we think about this when an application is present or not. The registry, file versions, MSIs, Windows installer databases, etc. But detection is the key to any state-based distribution, and we have to ensure that the detection is accurate. And so we are going to check across as many of these as possible in every situation. In ConfigMgr 07, a collection rule would target and status message would be appeared. We would pretty much fire and forget the software deployment model. Was used, that we would deploy applications as advertisements. They would go against the target systems, and we'd kind of wait for the response to come back either through the phone call help desk or through some of our reporting. Run once, not on a schedule, or on a schedule, so it could be run both ways. But was really in consideration or comparison to 12, it wasn't very smart. You know, downloading content and running a program, even if the software was already present, was often a case of experience, creating experiences for a user where they would have kind of erroneous error pops on their machines, and initiating help desk calls was pretty common. Well, in ConfigMgr 2012, application management is now state-based, and we now have rules that determine the applicability of software to a scenario, not just a machine. The presence determines if any action should take place on the device, and in this particular case that would be uninstall or install. Regular evaluations are done to check for and enforce compliance, as well as configuration of an application. But the bottom line is this is not historically done by admins and is a new key area to become familiar with. So requirement rules in ConfigMgr 2012 are new, and this is a major pillar supporting our state-based application management. And it's summarized in this way. Properties of users and/or devices that make delivering software appropriate are queried and used to understand if requirements are met or not. Rules are defined per deployment type. So if you think about a few slides ago, we had AppV and MSI and script and cab-based deployment types. The requirement rules are defined for each of those deployment types. It would be very common to have very different deployment types listed for an MSI-based install of an application versus the application format that is virtualized of that application. These are evaluated real-time, dynamically on the client at install time. They're not done once and forgotten or attempted to be remembered. They are done every single time and on the client side only. They are evaluated before the content is downloaded to the client, and so that ensures that even before the package delivery happens, the rules and criteria for requirements are met before an action is initiated. This is also very important to familiarize yourselves with, as historically this is done at collection levels, and this will fundamentally change how you target applications to users. So dependencies. Other deployment types that must be present in order for the current application deployment type to be installed. So think of a dependency as some kind of supporting code or application or client that has to be present in order for your current application you're delivering to be successfully installed and run by the user. There can be 1 to n dependencies. It can be things like this and or this. Things like a .NET framework could be an example, either 3.5 or 4, and an Internet Explorer browser of IE 7, 8, or install 8 if it's not present, is one example of how a dependency could be shaped up. And so you can see from that example that a dependency can be made up of several different types of things and even different versions of those things within the list. Dependencies are also modeled as applications and can be deployed independently. And so things like that .NET framework or that Internet Explorer browser could also be deployed to those machines as their own deployment types, but they would still be checked in the same way. There are 2 dependency uses for the applicability of the app model. Dependency not present, don't install app, and dependency not present, auto-install the dependency applications in order for the application you're using or delivering to be successfully delivered. Content distribution is another major aspect of the application model, and we have done some significant improvements in this area over ConfigMgr 07. Some new things to make you aware of are, first, something called distribution point groups. They can be linked to collections to optimize administrative workflow, and we can provide automatic content distribution planning to those DPs if they're added to the group. So if you have a collection of groups and you add another distribution point to that group, we can automatically populate content onto that distribution point simply by that group membership being achieved. We have a new wizard called the Distribute Content Wizard, where we can send multiple packages to multiple DPs or groups at one time, significantly minimizing the administrative overhead with getting content replicated in the past. We detect application dependencies and add them to the distribution, so even the dependencies of the apps within that content will go into that group. And we select a task sequence and distribute all that related content as well. So in a task sequence, you might have a collection of tools, utilities, updates, packages that would go along. That would all there go as well in that one wizard process. Another term to mention is something called a content library. Files are stored once, and even if they're used across multiple applications, packages or update packages, they're referenced in one place. Only files required by the DP are distributed over the network, and so it's really simplifying the back-end storage by using pointers in single instance store. We've also got the ability to provide bandwidth control for our content management, and this allows us to customize time and utilization percentages on DPs to maximize the out of hours or off times that the organization is not using that location or WAN link. Another important aspect of our new application model is content monitoring. Some major feedback from our customers of ConfigMgr 07 was that they experienced challenges in understanding just exactly what content was replicated where. And although it was logged in certain files, both server-side and at remote locations as well as in the central locations, it wasn't easy to view. So we now provide content monitoring in console with rich graphical experiences. And we provide compliance of content distributed in multiple ways. Application packages, distribution point group levels, distribution point levels are all different ways content monitoring can be reported on. And we have the ability to validate content on a DP either as a set schedule or on demand, and we update package compliance in the monitoring node in as close to real time as possible. Deployment. This is a term previously referred to as advertisement, which has been a term we have used forever. But the term deployment now is much more realistic for what we're doing. We're not advertising anymore. We're actually deploying a deployment type. Deploying an application that could have different deployment types associated with it. A deployment is created when an application is deployed against a collection. And due to apps being state-based, we only deploy to a collection one time. There are two types of deployment purposes. One is required and the other is available. The required is like a mandatory advertisement in ConfigMgr 07, and the available deployment is like an optional advertisement in ConfigMgr 07. These are available for user-targeted and displayed in the software catalog, and they're also available for device-targeted environments that are displayed in the software center on the client. And there are two types of actions a deployment can have. It can be an installation or an uninstallation action. And we provide settings for pre-deployment features when targeting users or other user security group collections when we're pre-staging content. I'm going to go into my console. And here I am on my Configuration Manager 2012 console. You can see it is different. It is no longer the MMC console. Down the left side, we have the administrative node. We also have the software library, navigation experience. And within here, we have the application management, software updates, and operating systems all grouped into one area that is called software library. If we browse to the application management section, I have my applications, packages, approval requests, and global conditions. If I select my applications, this brings up a list of the current global application list in my Configuration Manager 2012 environment. And you can see as I browse down, I can select different applications, and my ribbon along the top of the console changes as I select different nodes of the console. I've mentioned a couple of terms. I want to highlight what those look like. So first I'll double-click or right-click on the Office 2010 and show you the properties of this application. And as this property sheet comes up, I'll go through a couple of the tabs to show them to you. The first is the general information about the product, the name, the version, when it was published, owners, etc. We have the catalog tab. This allows us to specify if the application is published onto the software catalog and any kind of customizations or text we want to provide there, including things like keywords for search, icons, locations for links of information, and more. Another one I want to highlight is the deployment types. This is the summary of the different deployment types that this Office 2010 package could be delivered in. In this particular case, you see AppV and MSI. Content locations. This is my list of distribution points. You can see this is a small demo environment we have, so only one is listed. Supersedence is an ability for us to say that this is the version of application that is most current, and these are the versions that are superseded by this version to allow us to ensure that we only have the most current or as small a list of versions as possible. Well, as I look at the bottom of the console, I can see here that I actually have a couple of different tabs as well. I have deployment types, and in my deployment types I have a virtual and an MSI-based install. I'll right-click on the MSI, and I'll open up the property page of the MSI Office install. This is a slightly different window, but has some commonality with the original properties sheet I showed you for the global application object. You can see I have a name here. My content is actually a path using UNC to the actual location of the Office information. I have a Programs tab that calls my setup.exe. Again, this is where we would path for this particular situation with Office. We would use the custom install wizard, and we would tag onto this the suppressions of the wizard, as well as attaching any MSP files to the Office for customization. In this very basic example, I've just left it to fire setup so you see the Office install. Product codes are also populated here. Detection methods, this is the actual MSI product code that this application is using, and that's what we would reference in the add and remove and the Windows installer database. The user experience allows us to define how the user would interact or have visibility to this application. Install for user or system, log on requirement, only when they're logged on or not. That would change if I changed this one. Installation program visibility, I can suppress that if I want. Allowed runtime, if we have understandings of how long the application takes, we can actually define those here. And then we can look at things like a max runtime variable that allows us to say, if there's maintenance windows and things like that defined, don't do this install if we're in the last 5 minutes of that maintenance window, for example. Requirements. This is a very important tab. The requirements allows us to define the requirements that this MSI version of Office is going to need to see present in order for this MSI to be qualified as the deployment type that would be installed. I have a very basic requirement type established here. It's called the corporate asset value. I can just bring this up and show you what it is. It's a custom category. The condition is a corporate asset. It's a registry key value, and it equals true. So if the MSI, in order for the MSI version of Office to be installed, I have to have a corporate asset tag in the registry, which is a fairly common example of how IT would build a machine. They have a build value or an asset tag in the registry. And I can add others. I can add different criteria through a different, simply hitting a window button that opens up a custom device or user category. If I select user, this will populate down a couple of choices here for me. The condition is I can say, is this the primary device of the user or not? And it would equal true or false. So basically we could also say that this has to be a corporate asset registered machine. And we also have to have the primary user as the application recipient on the machine here. There are others. We can add things like device, user, custom. Custom can be just about anything. If I look at the conditions that populate from here, corporate asset is one that I've defined, but I can create additionals. So I can create a new one, and this will browse me in and allow me to do things like load a remote registry, create some common naming and definitions for it as a registry value. It could be WMI, it could be an assembly, a file system, you name it. However we can query the machine. We can define a value that we could use as a requirement in the deployment of anything. So very customizable at that point. I won't bother creating that. And I'll back out of that, and I'll finally go and show you some of the experiences in the console. You can see I've got the AppV and MSI deployment types. I can hit the wizard ribbon up here, create deployment type. This will kick off a wizard process to say, let's go and create some additional deployment types. And I have the ability in the drop-down menu to select Windows Installer, Script, AppV, Mobile Cab, or in this case, Nokia sys or jar files as well. And those are the different deployment types that can be created. And that is also where you could see things like Citrix involved. So Citrix XenApp or Zen Desktop could be included here to even have a deployment type that passes off to even like a VDI session. Pretty cool. We've also got an ability to look at the relationships. And so I can say here, show me a visual of the global conditions that are in play for me determining if Office Virtual or MSI is installed. And you can see here that I have the Office 2010 application, I have the virtual and the MSI formats of the deployment type, and then under each of those I have some requirements that are having to be met in order for that to be deployed. And so you can see the MSI, there's a corporate asset tag value I'm looking for. Office 2010 Virtual has the corporate asset tag as well. But that's a nice virtual way, or sorry, a nice visual way to view the different ways that applications could be delivered from their deployment types. Just to quickly pause as well, over on the administration navigation, just to talk about software management, we also have, under security and permissions, some security roles that are defined specifically for application management. And so you can see the top three I've highlighted here are examples in our role-based administration model of the different roles that people can be assigned to assist in managing applications. App Administrator, App Author, and App Deployment Manager are all different security templates that can help assist in defining scope of control for managing applications in the environment. So I've shown you a brief overview of the application, categories, the properties of the application globally, as well as deployment types and deployments, as well as the role-based administration application roles that people can become members of in their daily roles. So let's talk about user device affinity. User device affinity is very key and allows us to truly move towards what we call user-centric software distribution. This allows us to define a relationship between people and hardware and allows the administrator to think about that user first, while also ensuring that the application doesn't simply follow the user on every single machine they log into, which could even include things like servers. So user device affinity allows us to assist in understanding primary devices as well as non-primary devices, and also ensuring that we are not having applications just simply follow users and tattoo with installations based on wherever they log in. Configuration Manager 2012 supports a couple of different ways UDA can be used. Single primary user to primary device, multiple primary devices per user, or multiple primary users per device. And when you think about it, the first one is Melissa uses her primary laptop. Melissa uses a couple of main machines, corporate desktop, corporate laptop, corporate device, mobile device, and then multiple users per device. So think about a call center, 2 or 3 shifts in the day using the same computer in one location. So user device affinity, in summary, allows the system to define a relationship between a user and their hardware and the software they're going to receive on those different experiences. So what are the benefits of user device affinity? Because UDA seems like a pretty powerful and complex process. This allows the deployment of software based on the nature of a relationship between a user and the hardware they're on. So to give you an example, only install the MSI version of Visio if the device is a primary device of the targeted user, otherwise don't even install it. Second example, install MSI of AppV version of Office when the device is a primary device of the user's targeted, or install the Citrix XenApp version if the device is not their primary device. So to put those two into real-world terms, we'll do the MSI installation of Visio if it's the machine that's primarily used by that user, Melissa, and only use the MSI version or AppV version of Office if Melissa is on their primary device. If it's not the primary device, redirect them to the Citrix XenApp application version of that application. UDA also allows the pre-deployment of software, so we can kind of pre-stage the application to the target system. This allows software to be pre-deployed on a user's primary device whether they are there or not. So the classic scenario of over the weekend, over the weeknights, staging machines with not just software but patches can significantly improve the user experience with IT. So how can UDA be set? Because there's a few different ways it can be established. There are different ways that user-device affinity relationships are defined. We can use it. We can define this based on a usage threshold on the client. So we can look at things like login data and see that Melissa is logging into that machine 98% of the time, and 2% of the time it's the local administrator account. So we pretty much know it's her machine. We can import from an external source. We can define this as part of an operating system deployment. We can do it during mobile device enrollment. So as a mobile device is enrolled in the environment, we can actually say this is the primary device of that user, Melissa. We also have a tab on the software catalog, a web-based experience of the application installation service, where the user can actually browse to a tab that says My Primary Devices, and we can even provide them the ability to populate that themselves. And then finally, obviously, we can do it manually at an administrator level in the console. Client agent settings are also a part of this, and we have an ability to define UDA configurations at a collection level. And also, usage and user-based user-device affinity can be enabled and configured using client agent settings. So when you think about how collections are now used and the different ways that collections can be populated or resources can be rearranged, things like VDI can become very popular in this discussion as well. Software catalog. The software catalog is a web-based experience that allows the administrative team to provide applications through a web experience to users to install and bring down to their machines themselves on demand. It allows for browsing and searching for software. This can be fully localized for sites and application languages. There can be searching and categories and filters applied against the list to simplify their experience. It's very rich in Silverlight. It's quite a rich experience in that respect. We can install software from the catalog directly as a self-install from the catalog installation buttons. And we can also leverage infrastructure behind for content and status. And then we can also do automatic installations upon approval. So if the user requires approval from an application request, it can be done right from the console by simply submitting a request instead of install. The requesting or approval requirement for applications is established by the administrator. And if an application has some kind of requirement that might be license-based or training or cost or something of that nature, when the administrative decisions are made about the delivery of the application, we can place an approval requirement on the application deployment so the user won't be able to install until the approval is granted. It is a basic approval workflow, but in many of our test case scenarios has proven to be effective in covering a lot of use cases for organizations. When the application request is made, there is actually a navigation experience in the console, which is called Application Requests. And the administrator can simply go there and with one-click actions can approve or deny applications with custom text and messaging to the user. So how does an on-demand installation work? And let's just walk through the process. So Melissa on the right side clicks an installation on the application catalog in the browser. The website, the application catalog checks the user's permissions to do the installation. The website requests a client ID from ConfigMgr's client agent and passes that over to the site server. The server creates a policy for that specific situation and application and sends it back to the client. The client agent evaluates the requirements. This is the application model now being done, and from the policy and initiates the installation or not. And the client agent completes the installation process and reports the status back to the central site server. So as you can see through this process, the user initiates the process, the application model takes over, looks at permissions, requirements, dependencies, and does the action down through Melissa to that machine, and then her relationship and success of that application install is reported back to the site server. So as we talk about application evaluation, let's just go through what the workflow could look like. First of all, let's talk about requirements. New policies, app installs, or schedules can be examples of requirements and have they been met or not or exceeded. If they haven't been met or established as equal, then we pass a no, a fail, or a denial back. And if the requirements are met, for example, policy is approved, the app is an installation that will work, our rules are passing, then yes, it is installed. Is it already there? Yes, then we pause or complete that process and report back that application is already present. If it's no, then we continue on with the install, and we check for dependencies at that point. So we then look to the application dependency list and begin to verify if those are there and subsequently do those actions. If those dependencies are not installed, we install them. So we'll bring those along and install those before we actually deliver the main payload. If they are, we then do the installation of the application. So it's a very basic workflow, but it shows you how we evaluate the process of app presence, dependencies, requirements, etc., through the installation process for the user. So these multiple deployment types bring a lot of benefit to the organization. It's a flexible way to deliver different installation formats based on conditions. And when I say condition, what I'm referring to there are scenarios. Melissa may find herself on 3 or 4 different types of hardware in 3 or 4 different locations and connections throughout her workday. We want to ensure that the platform for management is flexible enough to understand when those change and evolve rapidly with those to not create a negative experience for Melissa, where she has to interact with the help desk or tap on her neighbor's shoulder or just basically not get something done. There are no restrictions on the number of deployments, on the number of deployment types. Many of the same types of deployment can be added to an application, each representing a different flavor or transform. So we could, for example, have under the Office 2010 example I showed you, we could have as many as a dozen different types of Office installation for the HR department, the accounting department, the German PR department, etc. So deployment types can not just be different formats of application, they can also be different types of a same deployment type. For example, the ones I just referred to there were maybe the Office MSI install, and we're simply calling different transforms. AppV or remote desktop services applications might go to a guest logged into a kiosk, full MSI to a primary user on a primary machine, as a very basic example of how deployment types can be defined. The built-in deployment types that come out of the box from ConfigMgr 2012 are MSI, Script, AppV, and Windows Mobile. And there is a collection of additional partner add-ons with people like Nokia, Citrix, and more that will certainly add to that list based on their installations. So one of the big elements we've talked about is virtualized versions of applications, and we introduced this in ConfigMgr 07R2, and we have continued to evolve our application virtualization in ConfigMgr 2012. And so let's just quickly summarize what's changing from 07 to 2012 for virtualized formats of applications. The integration requires AppV 4.6. That is a requirement we have as a minimum for the AppV client. The AppV client is used locally to, once we received policy and package, the local AppV client is used to launch the sequenced application format. Our new application model has user-centric features that enable the support for app dependencies, improved update behavior, the selective publishing of components, and as in addition to that, the dynamic suiting of multiple applications. We have instant gratification for unlock events. What we've learned in the past was we had to improve the delivery time of applications and advertisements. And so in ConfigMgr 07, SP2, and R3, we reduced both a 2-minute hard-coded policy buffer and a 10-minute delay in the client to improve the delivery and execution of policy on the machine at login time. Well, that was a significant improvement for us for advertisement delivery of policy. However, what we realized is that a lot of people don't log out of their machines anymore. And so what we've moved to is actually doing policy refresh at the desktop unlock event. So as machines have a laptop lid go down and come up, and we do a Control-Alt-Delete and go back to the desktop, we will do policy refresh at that point to do a lot of the delivery of policy and refresh of policy that this scenario could cover. We also have integration for remote desktop, or what we've formerly known as terminal services, to allow applications to be delivered as virtualized formats within remote desktop. Content improvements, we've improved our streaming, which is now based off our distribution points. That was introduced in ConfigMgr 07R2. And we have achieved an ability to reduce the virtual app footprint when downloading and executing. In the past, we had duplicate and even triplicate copies of cache, and that has now been reduced. So software distribution on mobile devices is also an area of focus for the application model. And the goal was very simple. a simplified, unified, easy-to-manage software distribution experience for users and administrators on mobile devices that are non-traditionally compared to a non-traditional scenario compared to a desktop or laptop. So for software, we have an ability to automatically install on devices as required, so we can provide applications to those machines as required. For the end user, we can automatically associate to their device using user device affinity. And then for administrators, we have abilities to maintain a unified deployment and monitoring of applications across both devices and classic machines like laptops and desktops. And so when we think about devices in the application model, they are a first-class citizen for us, and we think about them as a noble target that could receive an application in a very common list of scenarios that Lady Melissa could find herself in. So let's talk for a moment about the relationship of applications and user device affinity and what's called a task sequence, classically used for operating system deployment. Task sequences are also used outside of OS deployment for complex application distribution, and we have an ability to do that now in the application model in a few different ways. Applications are optimized for user targeting, and so we have an ability to have task sequences that are still machine-based, but thinking about the user and the user's context in perspectives of UDA and the app model. The apps are optimized for conditional delivery. Dependencies, requirements, etc. are going to be checked. We're not preventing the use of task sequences, however applications will cover almost all scenarios. So what we have found is, in ConfigMgr 07, organizations that say they would want to use task sequences for complex application installs now have an ability to say the application model will cover their requirements or their scenarios they were checking off the boxes for task sequences on. Task sequences are really designed for the deployment of operating systems. And we only install applications that require user state restore as part of a task sequence now. And so the real goal is to separate applications from the task sequence engine, even though that's been done in the past. So in summary, in Part 1 here of ConfigMgr Application Management Part 1, we've talked about the application model and how it supports the different types of software that can be distributed, MSI, script, AppV, mobile cabs. We've talked about greatly improved dependency handling, installation requirement changes, improved detection methods, supersedence and app uninstall. We've covered user device affinity, as well as a consolidated or unified monitoring experience. In addition, we covered the end user experience of the software catalog and software center, as well as summarizing the content management on the back end from the administrative console down to the distribution point and different hierarchy roles. Some things you can be doing now is definitely evaluating our product through the evaluation links. You can look at our virtual machines, our TechNet labs. We run something called the Community Evaluation Program, as well as our blog and website, which can be linked off of this page. That concludes the Part 1 of Application Management in Configuration Manager 2012, brought to you by the Microsoft Virtual Academy.